There are countless ways bread gets ruined by Britons before it ever reaches the table. From the flour people choose, to the way the dough is handled, the oven temperature, and even what happens after the loaf comes out of the oven. The problem is that most of these mistakes don't feel like mistakes at all. They're habits people repeat every time they bake. And because the bread still looks like bread when it comes out of the oven, many people assume that's just how homemade bread is supposed to be. Today, we're going to look at some of the biggest mistakes every Briton makes when baking bread, explaining exactly why they happen and how they affect the final loaf. And if you stay with us until the end, we'll also walk through the proper way to bake bread step by step so you can see how the entire process is meant to work from start to finish. Starting with the wrong flour. For many Britons, baking bread begins with a simple decision that seems completely harmless. They walk into the kitchen, reach for the flour they already have in the cupboard, and start mixing the dough. It might be plain flour, self-raising flour, or whatever was left over from baking cakes or biscuits earlier in the week. Because flour looks the same no matter the type, most people assume it behaves the same way in bread. But that assumption quietly creates problems before the dough has even had a chance to develop. Different flours are built for different jobs, and bread is one of the few types of baking that relies heavily on a specific structure forming inside the dough. Bread flour usually contains more protein than ordinary plain flour. That extra protein is what allows gluten to form properly when the dough is kneaded. Gluten acts like a network that traps gas produced by the yeast, allowing the bread to rise and hold its shape as it bakes. When the wrong flour is used, that network never develops the way it should. Instead of building strength, the dough stays weak and loose. It may feel fine while mixing, but once fermentation begins, the dough struggles to hold the air created by the yeast. That's why loaves made with the wrong flour often spread outward rather than rising upward. The bread comes out flatter than expected, with a dense crumb and very little structure inside. This is especially frustrating for people who follow the recipe exactly. They measure the ingredients carefully, knead the dough, wait for it to rise, and still end up with a loaf that feels heavy when sliced. From the outside, everything appears to have been done correctly, but the issue actually began the moment the flour was chosen. Another complication appears when self-raising flour is used for bread. Because it already contains raising agents designed for cakes, it interferes with the natural fermentation process of yeast. The dough behaves unpredictably, and the final loaf rarely develops the texture people expect from proper bread. This is why professional bakers are extremely particular about flour selection. The type of flour determines how strong the dough becomes and how well the loaf holds its shape during baking. There's another mistake many people make immediately after mixing the dough, one that seems like it should help but often makes the bread even heavier. Adding too much flour while mixing the dough. Once the dough is mixed and begins to come together, many home bakers run into a situation that feels immediately frustrating. The dough feels sticky. It clings to the bowl, it sticks to the counter, and sometimes it even pulls at the hands while kneading. For many Britons baking bread at home, the instinctive response is simple. Add more flour. It feels like the obvious solution. If the dough is sticky, more flour should fix it, so another handful goes in, then another. The dough becomes easier to handle, less messy, and far more manageable on the work surface. At that moment, it feels like the right decision. But this is one of the most common ways homemade bread quietly becomes heavy and dense. Bread dough is meant to contain a certain level of moisture. That hydration allows gluten to develop properly as the dough is kneaded. The water and flour interact to form a flexible structure capable of stretching and trapping the gases produced by yeast. When too much flour is added during mixing, that balance changes. Instead of forming a soft, elastic dough, the mixture becomes tighter and drier. The gluten network struggles to stretch, which means the dough cannot trap as much gas during fermentation. As the bread rises, it simply doesn't have the flexibility needed to expand properly. The result usually appears later in the baking process. The loaf may still rise a little, but the crumb inside becomes compact instead of airy. When sliced, the bread feels heavier than expected. Sometimes the texture even appears slightly crumbly rather than soft and open. What makes this mistake so easy to repeat is that sticky dough feels wrong to most people. Baking is often associated with tidy mixtures and clean work surfaces, but bread dough behaves differently from cake batter or pastry. A certain amount of stickiness is actually a sign that the hydration level is correct. Professional bakers often work with dough that looks far wetter than most people would feel comfortable handling at home. They rely on technique rather than extra flour to manage it. So when flour keeps getting added to make the dough easier to handle, the bread slowly loses the very moisture it needs to rise properly. And while overflouring can quietly weigh down the entire loaf, another mistake many people make happens during the next stage of the process, when the dough is supposed to be developing its strength. Rushing the kneading process. The dough is turned out onto the counter, the hands go to work, and kneading begins. In simple terms, kneading means repeatedly folding the dough over itself, pressing it down with the heel of your hand, and then turning it before doing it again. This motion stretches the dough, much like gently stretching a piece of soft rubber. For many people baking at home, this stage is treated almost like a quick chore that simply needs to be done before moving on. The dough gets folded, pushed, and turned for a few minutes until it begins to feel smoother. At that point, many people assume the job is finished and move on to the rising stage. But kneading is not just about mixing the dough. It's about building structure. When flour and water combine, the proteins inside the flour begin forming gluten. Gluten is what gives bread its strength and elasticity. During kneading, those gluten strands gradually align and stretch, creating a network that can trap the gases produced by yeast during fermentation. If the dough isn't kneaded long enough, that network never fully develops. At first, this may not be obvious. The dough can still look smooth and feel soft in the hands. But once fermentation begins, the weakness inside the dough becomes much more noticeable. As the yeast produces gas, the dough struggles to hold it. Instead of expanding upward, it spreads outward and collapses more easily. This is why bread made with under-kneaded dough often rises unevenly or loses volume during baking. The crumb inside the loaf may appear tight with fewer air pockets than expected. The bread can feel heavier when sliced, and the texture sometimes turns slightly crumbly rather than elastic. On the other hand, some people go to the opposite extreme and knead aggressively, assuming that more effort will produce better bread. But dough doesn't respond well to being forced. Kneading works best when it happens steadily, giving the gluten strands time to stretch and organize themselves. Professional bakers often judge kneading not by time, but by feel. When the dough becomes smooth, elastic, and slightly springy to the touch, it usually means the gluten network has developed properly. Rushing this stage prevents that structure from forming, which means the dough enters fermentation already at a disadvantage. And even when the dough has been kneaded correctly, another factor quietly influences how well it rises, something many people overlook completely while the dough is resting in the kitchen. Shortening the rising time. Bread baking requires waiting, and for many people baking at home, that waiting can feel longer than expected. The dough sits quietly on the counter, sometimes taking an hour or more before it noticeably changes in size. Because of this, many home bakers begin checking the dough early. They lift the cloth, look at the bowl, and try to judge whether it has risen enough. If it appears slightly larger or feels lighter when touched, it's tempting to move on to the next step. But fermentation is doing far more than simply making the dough bigger. During the rising stage, yeast is slowly producing gas inside the dough, while enzymes and bacteria begin breaking down the flour in ways that improve both texture and flavor. This process gives bread its internal structure and the subtle depth of flavor people associate with a well-made loaf. When the rising time is cut short, that development never fully happens. At first, the dough may still look acceptable. It might have increased in size, and it might feel soft when handled. But inside the dough, the gluten network hasn't stretched enough to hold gases properly. As a result, when the bread goes into the oven, it struggles to expand the way it should. This is why loaves made with under-risen dough often feel tight and compact when sliced. Instead of having a light, airy crumb, the bread appears dense with very small air pockets. The texture feels heavier than expected, and the flavor can seem flat because fermentation didn't have enough time to develop the natural complexity of the dough. Another issue appears during baking itself. When dough hasn't risen long enough, the yeast tries to compensate once the heat of the oven activates it. That sudden burst of activity can cause uneven expansion, which sometimes leads to cracks in the loaf or a shape that looks slightly collapsed. Bakers rarely judge rising time strictly by the clock. Instead, they look for signs that the dough has developed enough strength and elasticity to continue. The dough should feel slightly airy, soft, and able to spring back gently when pressed. Rushing this stage may save a little time, but it often leads to bread that feels unfinished once it's sliced. Even when the dough has risen properly, another mistake can quietly undo that work. Something that happens during the shaping stage before the loaf ever reaches the oven. Shaping the dough incorrectly. After the dough has finished rising, many people move quickly to the next step. The dough is taken out of the bowl, placed on the counter, and shaped into a loaf before going into the baking tin or onto a tray. For most home bakers, this part of the process seems straightforward. The goal simply feels like turning the dough into something that resembles the shape of bread. But shaping does much more than decide how the loaf looks. When dough is shaped correctly, the surface of the dough develops something bakers call tension. By gently stretching the outer layer of the dough while forming the loaf, the baker creates a smooth surface that helps the dough hold its shape during the final rise and in the oven. Without that tension, the dough behaves very differently. Many people simply press or fold the dough loosely into a shape. It may look like a loaf at first, but because the surface hasn't been tightened, the structure inside the dough remains unstable. As the bread rises in the oven, instead of pushing upward and forming a tall loaf, the dough often spreads outward. This is one of the reasons homemade bread sometimes looks flatter than expected, even when everything else in the process seemed to go well. Another issue appears when the dough is handled too roughly during shaping. After rising, the dough contains pockets of gas created during fermentation. These pockets are important because they contribute to the light texture of the finished bread. When the dough is pressed too aggressively or squeezed too much while shaping, many of those gas pockets are forced out. The dough then enters the oven with less internal air, which again leads to bread that feels heavier when sliced. The goal is to guide the dough into shape while preserving the structure that is already developed during fermentation. When shaping is done correctly, the dough rises upward rather than outward, producing a loaf with better volume and a more open crumb inside. But even perfectly shaped dough can struggle during baking if the oven environment itself isn't stable, something that many home bakers unknowingly interfere with while the bread is baking. Baking bread in an unstable oven. The first few minutes inside the oven are actually one of the most important stages of the entire process. This is when something called oven spring occurs. As the heat hits the dough, the gases trapped inside expand rapidly. The yeast becomes extremely active for a short moment before the heat finally stops fermentation and the structure of the bread begins to set. If the oven environment is stable, this stage allows the loaf to rise beautifully, creating height and a light crumb inside. However, many home bakers unintentionally disrupt this process. One of the most common habits is opening the oven door too early. People naturally become curious about how the bread is progressing, especially if the loaf begins to smell good or the top starts turning golden. The instinct is to open the door, take a look, maybe rotate the tray and check how things are going. But every time the oven door opens, a significant amount of heat escapes. That sudden drop in temperature interrupts the oven spring. Instead of continuing to rise steadily, the loaf may stop expanding too soon. The bread can end up shorter than expected, and the crumb inside may feel tighter because the dough didn't have enough time to expand fully. Another problem comes from ovens that are not properly preheated. Bread relies on strong, consistent heat from the very beginning of baking. If the oven hasn't reached the correct temperature before the loaf goes in, the dough warms slowly instead of receiving that immediate burst of heat needed for proper expansion. In that situation, the bread may still bake through, but the structure will often be weaker and the crust less developed. Professional bakers rely on stable oven conditions because bread responds dramatically to even small changes in temperature. At home, however, many ovens fluctuate more than people realize, especially when the door is opened repeatedly during baking. These small interruptions may seem harmless in the moment, but they can quietly affect how the loaf rises and sets. When the bread comes out of the oven looking perfect, there is still one mistake that many people make immediately afterwards, a habit that can ruin the texture of the loaf within seconds. Cutting the bread too soon. Once the bread comes out of the oven, the entire kitchen usually fills with that unmistakable smell of freshly baked bread. The crust is golden, the loaf looks finished, and for many people, the natural reaction is to grab a knife and slice into it straight away. It's one of the hardest temptations to resist when baking bread at home. After all, the bread looks ready, the crust feels firm, and the loaf has clearly finished baking. So cutting into it immediately seems perfectly reasonable, but inside the bread something important is still happening. Even though the loaf has left the oven, the interior is still extremely hot. Steam trapped inside the crumb is continuing to move through the bread, redistributing moisture as the structure finishes setting. This final stage is what allows the inside of the loaf to stabilize and develop the soft, airy texture people expect. When bread is sliced too soon, that process is interrupted. The moment the knife cuts through the loaf, a large amount of steam escapes. Instead of remaining inside the bread where it helps balance the moisture, it rushes out into the air. As a result, the crumb inside the loaf can collapse slightly, leaving the bread with a gummy or slightly wet texture. This is why freshly cut bread sometimes sticks to the knife or appears slightly compressed where it's sliced. Another issue appears as the loaf cools further. Because the steam escaped too quickly, the remaining crumb may dry unevenly. The outside of the loaf might feel fine, but the interior texture never quite settles the way it should. Professional bakers almost always allow bread to cool before slicing. Depending on the size of the loaf, this cooling period can take anywhere from 20 minutes to over an hour. During that time, the internal structure finishes stabilizing, allowing the crumb to firm up properly without losing moisture. Waiting can feel frustrating, especially after spending so much time preparing the dough and baking the loaf. But giving the bread that final resting period often makes the difference between bread that feels slightly gummy and bread that slices cleanly with a light, balanced texture. Now that we've gone through the most common mistakes people make when baking bread at home, it becomes much easier to understand how the entire process is meant to work when everything is done correctly. How to properly bake bread, the process that fixes everything. After seeing how small mistakes can affect bread at every stage, the good news is that baking bread properly doesn't require complicated techniques or special equipment. What it really comes down to is understanding how each step of the process supports the next. It starts with choosing the right flour. Many people in the UK instinctively grab plain flour, because that's what most kitchens already have in the cupboard. But plain flour is not designed for bread. Its protein content is usually too low to build the strong gluten network that bread dough needs in order to rise properly. For bread, what you really want is strong bread flour. In most UK supermarkets, this is clearly labelled as strong white bread flour or strong wholemeal bread flour. Brands such as Allinson's strong white bread flour, Shipton Mill strong white flour, or Dove's Farm. Strong bread flour are commonly used by home bakers because they contain a higher level of protein, usually around 12 to 14%. That extra protein is important because when flour mixes with water, those proteins form gluten. Gluten is what gives dough the strength to stretch, trap gas from the yeast, and rise upward instead of spreading flat. Using the wrong flour is one of the biggest reasons homemade bread sometimes turns out dense or heavy, even when the rest of the process seems correct. Once the flour is right, the next step is mixing the dough properly. When combining flour, water, yeast, and salt, many people panic when the dough feels slightly sticky. The instinct is to keep adding more flour to make it easier to handle. But that extra flour can dry the dough out and reduce the hydration level the bread needs to develop a soft crumb. A slightly soft or tacky dough is usually a sign that the hydration level is correct and that the gluten will develop properly during kneading. During kneading, take your time. Kneading means folding and pressing the dough repeatedly so the gluten strands stretch and organize themselves into a strong structure. When the dough becomes smooth, elastic, and slightly springy to the touch, that usually means the gluten network has developed enough to support fermentation. Next comes the rising stage, often called fermentation. Dough rises best in a stable, moderately warm environment. If the kitchen is too cold, the yeast works slowly and the dough struggles to rise. If it's too warm, the yeast can become overly active and the dough may ferment too quickly. A comfortable room temperature is usually enough for the yeast to work steadily. Allow the dough to rise fully rather than rushing to the next step. Fermentation is where much of the bread's flavor and internal structure develop. Once the dough has risen, shaping becomes important. Handle the dough gently and form it into a loaf while creating a slightly tight outer surface. This tension helps the dough hold its shape during baking so the loaf rises upward instead of spreading out. Before baking, make sure the oven is fully preheated. Bread depends on an immediate burst of heat to trigger what bakers call oven spring, the rapid expansion that happens in the first few minutes of baking. Opening the oven door too early can release heat and interrupt that process. Finally, once the bread comes out of the oven, allow it to cool before slicing. Even though the crust looks finished, the inside of the loaf is still extremely hot. Steam inside the bread is redistributing moisture and helping the crumbs stabilize. Cutting the loaf too soon releases that steam and can leave the bread slightly gummy inside. Letting the loaf cool allows the crumb to set properly so the bread slices cleanly and keeps its texture. Bread baking may look simple, but each stage plays a role in creating the final loaf. When those stages are handled carefully, the process becomes far more predictable. And once you understand what's happening inside the dough at each step, baking bread at home becomes much less of a mystery. If you recognized a few of these habits in your own kitchen, you're certainly not alone. Many of these mistakes are extremely common, even among people who bake regularly. Let us know in the comments which one surprised you the most. And if you found this breakdown helpful, kindly give the video a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next deep dive into everyday cooking habits. Thanks for watching.